In today's lecture on morphology, we will move away from discrete linguistic signs like graphemes and phonemes and focus our attention on the smallest meaningful linguistic units, morphemes. Morphology is commonly divided into two areas. The first is concerned with the arrangement of morphemes within the same lexeme, which is inflectional morphology. The second one is the arrangement of morphemes to create new lexemes, which is word formation. We will deal with Middle High German word formation in detail in the next lecture, while today will be about the rules for the inflection of Middle High German morphemes. It is by no means trivial to point out that not all Middle High German words have different word forms. When it comes to prepositions like von or us, adverbs like so and do, as well as the negation particle nicht, there is no need to look them up in a dictionary. If you did decide to do so, you might find that they are listed there exactly as they appear in the text. The distinction between words and word forms makes no sense in the cases mentioned, since they are all either non-inflecting words or non-inflecting parts of speech. From a historical linguistics perspective, however, it is noteworthy that words or entire parts of speech can change their inflectional status over the course of language history. In the history of German, this primarily affects adverbs. In Middle High German, adverbs can be derived from adjectives using the suffixes lich or liechen. This option is lost by New High German. Adjectival adverbs lose their inflectional ending and appear in the zero form of their adjective base. An account of the inflectional morphology of Middle High German would have to deal with the adverbs, while the adverbs of New High German have become essentially uninteresting as they no longer inflect. How can we determine the basic units of inflectional morphology more precisely? We have already established that morphemes are the smallest meaningful units in a language. Their meaning can be either lexical or grammatical. As such, a distinction is made between lexical and grammatical morphemes, with lexical morphemes often being referred to as base morphemes. On a second level, morphemes can be distinguished based on their distribution, specifically according to whether they can occur freely or are bound to certain companions in their realization. Base morphemes and grammatical morphemes can occur both free and bound. Middle High German lang can occur alone and is to be determined as a free base morpheme, while Middle High German salb can only be realized in connection with an inflectional ending and must therefore be understood as a bound base morpheme, which occurs, for example, in the imperative form salbe. Middle High German ich carries exclusively grammatical information. The pronoun realizes the first person singular but can occur alone, while derivational morphemes such as ere in tichtere, which means author, and inflectional morphemes such as the genitive singular ending s are always realized in a bound form. If we try to summarize this overview, we can say that today's focus is on a class of bound grammatical morphemes of Middle High German, namely its inventory of inflectional morphemes. Particular interest should be given less to an exhaustive description of the inventory than to a focus on cases that show significant changes for the Middle High German inflectional system compared to its Old High German predecessor. To do this, we must first provide a brief description of the Old High German inflectional system, without which we cannot appropriately assess the innovations which took place in Middle High German. Furthermore, Middle High German inflectional morphology offers rich material for observing the interplay of phonological and morphological change. At the beginning of the Middle High German period, the weakening of unstressed syllables, which we discussed last week, would have almost led to the collapse of central areas of inflection had it not been for the morphological functionalization of further phonetic development, palatal or secondary umlaut. Because the consequences of the weakening of unstressed syllables in this area are particularly obvious, we will begin our overview with noun inflection before turning to Middle High German innovations in the area of verbal inflection. In German, nouns realize the categories of case and number and indeed have done so throughout all its historical periods. From the very beginning, and despite all prophecies of doom, the four cases of nominative, genitive, dative, and accusative, and the two numbers singular and plural, have existed in German to this day. Grammatical gender is usually mentioned as a further relevant nominal category in German, but it is a lexical grammatical category rather than a classic nominal category. Whether a noun is masculine, feminine, or neuter does not depend on its syntactic or morphological function, but is defined for each lexical entry and is therefore an inherent feature. Of course, this does not mean that there are no cases of multiple gender, as one can easily imagine given how spatially differentiated Middle High German is. This mostly affects basic vocabulary items. For New High German, die Schlange, feminine, the recently published Morphology volume of the New Middle High German grammar lists only 2 feminine tokens compared to 19 masculine tokens. 12th century, the Vienna Physiologus. So der Hirz den Slangen sichet, in dem Loche da ligget, so blaset in das Loch und triebet den Slangenus. Another example from around 1300 from the Vienna Martyrology. Und die große Schlange sterbete. For New High German, die Sonne, the grammar lists over 200 feminine examples, but still 26 masculine tokens, which, however, disappear in the course of the 13th century. The following evidence from the Weltchronik of Rudolf von Ems indicates that gender variations can also occur within the same source. First, we have folio 15a, da der Sonne aufgeht, and on the next page, noch Schatte fuhr der Sonnen schien. To be able to better assess the scope of restructuring noun inflection in Middle High German, let us first briefly review some prehistory. In Gothic, an East Germanic language primarily attested in the 4th and 5th centuries, noun inflection follows a pattern of which there are hardly any traces left in Middle High German. For illustration, we consider the dative plural Gothic dacham. In Gothic, each inflected form of a noun consisted of 3 segments. First is the root, the base morpheme carrying lexical meaning, in this case, dach, day. The same root dach can occur in different words. In Old High German, for example, alongside the noun tag is the weak verb tagen, to become day. The inflectional ending comes at the end. M for the dative plural. Between the root and the inflectional ending there is a word forming element that occurs in numerous other words and thus has a class forming effect. Alongside Gothic Thacham, there are Gothic Stenam, Wulfam, etc. The element adjoined to the root is called the stem suffix. The combination of root and stem suffix is called stem. The Germanic stem suffix a forms masculine and neuter gender nouns called a stems. Based on the situation in Gothic, from which we can draw conclusions about the Germanic branch as a whole, noun inflection after the emergence of German appears to represent a steady reduction of inflectional morphemes. The cause of this stems from the Germanic accent being fixed on the root syllable. The 6-case system on the singular of Germanic is reduced to a 2-case system in New High German. Now let's look at this development in detail. In Old High German, the Germanic system of stem clauses appears to have largely broken down. With the exception of the E stems, the naming of the inflection clauses after the Old Germanic stem suffixes is barely comprehensible. However, a change had also taken place in this class insofar as the E is no longer a root suffix but has been converted into an inflectional morpheme. There is certainly no lack of such inflectional morphemes in Old High German. Even if we restrict ourselves to the 4 core classes, we count 17 different inflectional endings that realize the nominal categories of case and number. The quantitative contrast to the Middle High German inventory could not be clearer. Middle High German was severely affected by the weakening of unstressed syllables and only has 6 different inflectional endings in the core classes. The long-term development that can be observed in the R stems, looking at Gothic Sachans right the way through to New High German Tag, can also be confirmed and chronologically specified by comparing Old and Middle High German noun inflection. German comes to have fewer and fewer means of expressing the grammatical category of case. The decisive trigger for this so-called casus nivellierung or case leveling is also the weakening of unstressed syllables in Middle High German. In the long run, case leveling is not the only consequence of the weakening of unstressed syllables. Of comparable importance from the systematical point of view is the complete collapse of the Germanic system of stem classes, which comes to be replaced by a new system structured according to synchronic morphological criteria. The changes in the class names from Old to Middle High German are not merely cosmetic. In the area of weak noun inflection, the Old High German N stems correspond to the first Middle High German inflection class. In the area of strong noun inflection, the O stems correspond to the second class, but the development of the R and E stems in the third and fourth Middle High German class is not quite so linear. We therefore try to examine this restructuring process a little more closely, focusing on the development of the Old High German A and E stems. A major difference between the Old High German A and E stems was plural inflection, which goes back to the Germanic stem suffix. The nominative plural of Old High German Tag, an A stem, was Tagger. The nominative plural of Old High German Gast, an E stem, was Gesti. Accordingly, the nominative plural of Old High German Skilled, also an E stem, was Skilti. In Old High German, the masculine nouns Gast and Skilled belong to the same inflection class because they both have endings containing E. These endings, which are decisive for denoting class membership, fall victim to the weakening of unstressed syllables in the transition to Middle High German. What are we to make of this? First of all, it is striking that little has changed in the relationship between the Middle High German Tag and Gast in terms of their classification criteria. As before, Tag and Gast show differences in plural formation. It is just the signifier that has changed compared to the Old High German predecessors. The plural ending is no longer distinctive. Old High German I and A have collapsed to Middle High German schwa. Rather, the presence or absence of the umlaut is the differentiator. The assumption that the presence of umlaut as a plural marker became the central criterion for the restructuring of the Old High German A and E stems, if not of the entire system, can now be substantiated by a series of further observations. Old High German E stems, such as skilled, skilty, whose root vowel cannot be subject to umlaut, no longer behave in Middle High German like their former Old High German classmates, but like the Middle High German successors of the Old High German A stems. They have no other choice, as the only signifier they shared with the E stems that were subject to umlaut, such as Gast, Gesti, has been leveled to schwa and the suffix weakening. They share the same fate as all other Old High German E stems that cannot be umlauted. Even more interesting is the development of the Old High German feminine E stems. On the one hand, it resembles what we have just observed in the masculine. The Old High German E stems, whose class criterion was the presence of E endings, Kraft, Kräfti, and Zieht, Ziti, are divided into 2 classes after the latter have been weakened. Firstly, Old E stems with the root vowel subject to umlaut, new feminine nouns of the fourth class, e.g. Kraft, Kräfte, and secondly, old E stems without an umlautable root vowel, the feminine nouns of a third class that have had no equivalent in Old High German, e.g. zieht, ziete. There is also a second tendency that begins to emerge in Middle High German. The fact that umlaut has replaced the E ending as an inflectional class feature is one thing, but the question of the morphological functionalization of the new criterion remains. In the area of fourth class masculine nouns, this is already transparent in Middle High German. In the singular, as a further development of the Old High German inflectional paradigm, there are only forms without umlaut. In the plural, there are only forms with umlaut. It is therefore obvious to interpret the umlaut as a new plural marker. Such an unambiguous interpretation of the fourth class feminine nouns too is prevented by the fact that umlauted forms not only occur in the entire plural, but can also occur in the genitive and dative singular as variants of non-umlauted forms. A famous text passage in which the morphological variants actually stand side by side is stanza 12 of the Nibelungenlied. Von des Hobbes Kräfte, umlautet, und von ihr Wieten Kraft, without umlaut, von ihr viel hohen Werdigkeit und von ihrer Ritterschaft, der die Herren Pflagen mit Freuden all ihr Leben, des entkündt ü zu wahren Jemen gar ein Ende geben. Well, we're not quite at the end. As undecided as the fourth class feminines seem to behave with regard to the functionalization of umlaut, double forms are illuminating for our understanding of longitudinal linguistic developments in Middle High German. In comparison with Old High German on the one hand and New High German on the other, they represent a transitional stage. The traditional umlauted forms in the genitive and dative singular indicate a phonological interpretation of umlaut. However, the simultaneous occurrence of non-umlauted forms in the singular is an indication of a morphological reinterpretation of umlaut, and is in fact a much clearer indication than in the fourth class masculines. Here, in principle, a morphological reinterpretation of Old High German phonology was sufficient. In the case of the feminine nouns, this reinterpretation led to the appearance of new non-umlauted singular forms that have no equivalent in Old High German. This tendency is then unified on the path to New High German. The double forms disappear. With this, a development in the context of German noun inflection has come to a temporary end, which can be understood as a complementary process to the Kasusnivellierung or case leveling explained earlier. This process is called Numerusprofilierung, an increase in the tendency to mark number in morphology. In a nutshell, the interaction of these two processes can be described as follows. In the course of German's development, inflected forms of noun realize case, less and less, and mark number, more and more. Without context, New High German Kraft does not indicate whether it's a nominative, genitive, dative, or accusative, but the classification as a singular is clear. Finally, the fact that umlaut has become an essential means of expression for the realization of the category number, which becomes increasingly prominent in New High German, can be shown by the third and fourth class neutres of Middle High German. These derive from a very small subclass of the Old High German A stems, the so-called Ir-neuters, which often denoted domestic animals, i.e. lamb, Rind, Kalb, and therefore have been informally known as the Hühnerhof-Deklination, the chicken run declension. In connection with the realization of Numerusprofilierung, the Hühnerhof-Deklination is of interest because the class-constitutive stem suffix ir causes an umlaut of the preceding root vowel. As we have just seen, the morphologically reinterpreted umlaut has been a privileged means of realizing the number category since Middle High German. A particularly strong indication of this would be if this means were also used to form the plural of words that were anything but predestined to do so based on their structural history. And this is exactly what happens to the former neutis of the Old High German A stems and the Middle High German successor, the third class. Their representatives were poorly prepared for the spread of numerus profilierung, as there were no inflectional endings in the nominative and accusative plural. However, the fact that plural is expressed by the inflectional morpheme 0 contradicts morphological iconism, a fundamental principle of natural morphology which, in a nutshell, states that more meaning should correspond to more expression. The neutis of Middle High German third class solve this dilemma by often adopting the number marking procedure of the Hühnerhof-Deklination, as in the case of Middle High German Buch, which since early New High German has inflected according to the pattern Blatt, Blätter. Therefore, its plural forms are no longer Buch, Buche, Buchen, Buch, but Bücher, Bücher, Büchern, Bücher. This process also happens in Middle High German neutis with a root vowel that cannot be umlauted, such as Kind, Kinder, Kindern, etc. Finally, the morphological development of Middle High German Wort shows that the Hühnerhof-Deklination was not the only source that contributed to the numerus profilierung of the Middle High German strong neutis. As you know, the plural of New High German Wort can neither be Worte or Wörter. In the case of the umlaut plural, Middle High German Wort has followed the Bücher, Bücher, Büchern, Büchern pattern, while the umlaut plural is based on the inflection of third-class masculines such as Middle High German Tag. Incidentally, the development towards number marking and away from case marking did not end with early New High German. Of course not. The most obvious developments in this direction are the appearance of a new plural marker, the inflectional ending s, as well as the further elimination of inflectional endings such as the dative e. Remember, Aufzug im Brandfalle nicht benutzen. Since the morphological consequences of the apocopies we discussed in detail in the last lecture affect certain parts of the noun paradigm more than others, but do not differ in principle from the general consequences of the weakening of unstressed syllables, we will not consider these cases separately at this point. Instead, let us now turn to key developments in Middle High German verbal inflection. First, some remarks on verbal inflection in general. Like their modern successors, Middle High German verb forms realized the grammatical categories of tense, mood, and voice. The grammatical category mood is realized in Middle High German almost exclusively via synthetic means, i.e. without auxiliary verbs, while the grammatical category tense already shows the first signs of using analytical verb forms, which we will go into in the session on syntax, or morphosyntax rather. In today's session, only the synthetic methods of Middle High German verb inflection will be discussed. Voice has been expressed by analytical construction since Old High German and therefore belongs more in a lecture on syntax or morphosyntax, as does the grammatical category person. We've already discussed the category of number in the context of noun inflection. Principle: the system of verb inflection in Middle High German compared to Old High German is affected by the same phonological upheavals as take place in the noun system. Therefore, the question must be asked of how specifically morphological restructuring measures like the weakening of unstressed syllables and the phonemization of umlaut, but also rather unspectacular phonic developments such as final devoicing, have affected Middle High German verbal morphology. First, let's have a little overview. As in present-day German, there are several types of verb inflection in Middle High German. The oldest method, going back to Indo-European, is strong inflection, which uses upload as a tense marker a morphologically interpreted alternation of the root vowel, which occurs, for example, in Middle High German sneeden, snate, or still in New High German schneiden, schnitt. In Middle High German, there are 7 recurring constellations of such alternations, which are known as Upload series, Upload-Reihen, and have caused sleepless nights for a generation of German students learning them. Come back to that in a minute. The so-called weak verb inflection emerges in Germanic and uses a dental suffix as a tense marker, as in Middle High German sagen, sagete, and in New High German sagen, sagte. In addition, Middle High German has a morphologically hybrid class, the so-called preterite presence, from the core of which a large part of the New High German modal verbs will develop. Middle High German sollen, sollte, New High German sollen, sollte, for instance. A few isolated hybrids such as denken, dünken, and beginnen, and finally a number of morphologically irregular verbs, e.g. Middle High German sehen, wählen, tun, and a few others. First, let's have a look at the strong verbs. From a diachronic point of view, the Middle High German system takes an intermediate position. On the one hand, Middle High German preserved the archaic upload system of Old High German with up to 5 different root vowels. We find this constellation in 4 upload series, namely 2a, biegen, büge, bog, buggen, gebogen, in 2b, bieten, büte, bot, butten, gebotten, in 3b, werfen, wirfe, warf, wurfen, geworfen, and finally in series 4, nemmen, nimme, nam, namen, genommen. The fundamental restructuring of the German upload system only took place in early New High German, where so-called tense stems with uniform root vowels in the present and past tense developed. On the other hand, the alternation of the root final consonants d, t, h, g, f, b, s, h, known as grammatischer Wechsel or grammatical change, which is still systematically carried out in Old High German, is already being reduced in strong verb inflection in Middle High German. This is mainly because the old and no longer synchronically transparent alternation rule is superimposed by phonetic innovations in Middle High German, namely the final devoicing discussed last week and its complementary development, the lenition of the voiceless dental plosive t to voiced d after a nasal. Old High German findan, findu, fand, funtun, funtan exhibits regular grammatischer Wechsel, and accordingly the root final consonant in the present tense and the past tense singular is the voiced d, and in the past tense plural and the past participle voiceless t. Middle High German final devoicing and lenition mean that the alternations in the past tense are reversed and the grammatische Wechsel disappears, resulting in finden, finde, fand, final devoicing, funden, lenition, and gefunden, also with lenition of the dental. Upload series, which coincidentally formed tense stems in the pre-Middle High German period, i.e. identical root vowels in the present and past tense, tend to reduce the effect of grammatischer Wechsel in Middle High German. Only verbs of the upload series 6 and 7 are affected. Old High German chladan, chladu, chluot, chluotun, ichlatan, with a regular alternation of d, t, develops into Middle High German laden, lade, luot, luoden, geladen. The dismantling of the morphologically redundant grammatical changes continuously extended after Middle High German, so that in the contemporary language only a few relic cases such as schneiden, geschnitten, or ziehen, gezogen remain. A functional innovation of Middle High German verbal inflection that is still operational today is the functionalization of umlaut as a modal marker for strong verbs. For clarification, let us set out a brief reminder of the conditions in present-day German. Strong verbs with a root vowel that cannot be umlauted produce forms of the subjunctive 1 by adding the inflectional ending to the present stem. For example, reite, and forms of the subjunctive 2 by adding the inflectional ending of the stem of the past tense, which gives ritte. Strong verbs with a root vowel capable of umlaut also mark the subjunctive 2 with an umlaut of the root vowel, geben, gäbe. The synthetically formed subjunctive 2 forms of weak verbs do not differ from the forms of the indicative past tense, such that periphrastic forms have to be used here, even with root vowels capable of umlaut, as in case of New High German wohnen. The form wohnte would be considered ungrammatical, and therefore würde wohnen is required. The last two characteristics of the modern day verbal inflection go back to developments in Middle High German. The functionalization of palatal or secondary umlaut to characterize the preterite subjunctive only takes place in strong verbs with a root vowel capable of umlaut. For example, in geben, a verb of the fifth upload series, whose root vowel in the subjunctive preterite is the umlaut of a, i.e. ä. In the case of strong verbs with root vowels that cannot be umlauted, root cannot be marked by umlaut, but the root vowels of the affected series 1 and 7 are so distinctive that the forms remain recognizable as preterites of the subjunctive. Middle High German ritte, first series, or Middle High German riete from the 7th a series can only be first or third person singular preterite subjunctives. The situation is different with weak verbs here. Here the umlaut is blocked by the dental suffix even in the case of root vowels capable of umlaut, so that in the past tense the forms of the indicative and subjunctive cannot be distinguished. In strong verb inflection, umlaut is widely used as a mood marker in Middle High German, as this overview shows. Nevertheless, its functionality can still be optimized, so to speak. The Middle High German system simply places an umlaut mechanically when in Old High German I follows a vowel that can be umlauted. This was the case throughout the subjunctive preterite, but also in the second person singular preterite indicative. Old High German du gabi, Middle High German du gäbe. The fact that this form does not fit into the inflectional scheme of Middle High German at all does not change the fact that, apart from regional exceptions, particularly in West Central German, it dominated in the inflection paradigm over modern forms in est, and without an umlaut until the 14th century. Only after eliminating this form in early New High German did umlaut fully become a modal marker. Unlike the strong inflection, where the old upload system remains largely untouched, weak inflection undergoes a far-reaching restructuring in Middle High German. Before we come to the causes and consequences, a few words about the initial situation. In Old High German, there were 3 inflection classes of weak verbs: en verbs, on verbs, and jan verbs, recognizable by their respective stem suffixes. Old High German jan verbs can be further subdivided according to 2 criteria. Firstly, according to the present or absence of the stem suffix, and secondly, according to the occurrence of an alternation of the root vowel, which is misleadingly called Rückumlaut, reverse umlaut, and goes back to primary umlaut, the remains of which are still present in New High German, for instance in senden, sandte, or nennen, nannte. As can be seen at first glance, the Middle High German system no longer has much in common with its predecessor. The stem suffixes as a class feature have disappeared, only the linking vowel and Rückumlaut remain. In turn, 2 well-known sound changes are responsible for this profound transformation. First, you might have guessed it, the weakening of the unstressed syllables levels not only the final syllables but also the stem suffixes e and o, which were still class-forming in Old High German. There is no synchronic evidence that the Middle High German verbs salben and fühlen once belonged to completely different Old High German inflection classes. In contrast, umlaut becomes increasingly important for the system of Middle High German weak verbs. It has already appeared in a number of Old High German young verbs, but been restricted to the primary umlaut e from a. Its structural importance remained rather insignificant. With the phonemization of palatal or secondary umlaut in Middle High German, the prerequisites are met for umlaut to play a central role in weak verb inflection. The Middle High German system makes use of this, at least quantitatively. In his Middle High German grammar, published in 1883, Karl Weinhold identified around 250 lexemes with Rückumlaut. In New High German, this innovative approach of Middle High German has not prevailed, apart from a few cases already mentioned, such as nennen, nannte, and senden, sandte, which, by the way, consistently go back to Old High German primary umlaut. To close today's session, a short excursion into linguistic theory. Don't be afraid. At least three factors argue against the consolidation of Rückumlaut as a tense marker for weak verbs. Some have to do with linguistic universals, others are more relevant because Rückumlaut in Middle High German was the wrong place at the wrong time, so to speak. In its specific distribution, which characterizes the infinitive and present tense by the presence of the umlaut and the preterite by the absence of the umlaut, Middle High German Rückumlaut, like the zero ending in the plural of some nouns, violates the principle of morphological iconism, according to which semantically unmarked units are morphologically more easily encoded than marked ones. In the case of Middle High German, however, the unmarked forms, namely the infinitive and present tense, are morphologically more complex, namely umlauted, while the marked form, the past tense, is morphologically easier to realize, at least insofar as no umlaut is present. The preterite of Middle High German weak verbs with Rückumlaut is not quite as morphologically simple, as it has a tense marker that has been tried and tested since Germanic, namely the dental suffix, which is more economical than the secondary umlaut. The signifier t constantly refers to the same meaning, namely preterite, while Rückumlaut involves more complex allomorphic relationships. It is mainly for this last reason that the price for redundant marking of the tense was probably a little too high here. Principles such as morphological iconism and avoidance of redundancy can be found in many languages at many times. However, there is a further possible reason for abandonment of the Rückumlaut as a tense marker, which has to do with the specific situation of verb inflection at the threshold from Middle to early New High German. On the whole, the inherited Old High German inventory of strong verbs remains untouched. However, a simple comparison of the class changes shows that the weak verbs have become the expanding class since late Middle High German at the latest, with schrien, spieven, sneeven, geschehen, jehen, pflegen, heaven, and seben, ehren, rufen, wurfen. At least 11 formally strong verbs in Middle High German are wholly or partially attested with weak inflection, while the reverse constellation only occurs 4 times, namely with nieden, truven, eischen, and verkunnen. In this situation, a pattern of verb inflection which wants to introduce an originally strong method into the weak inflection with alternating root vowels is highly unfavored. This development will be accentuated towards New High German. The current standard language exhibits an immense and ever-increasing set of weak verbs that were originally strong, while reversed cases are merely anecdotal and probably more lexical than morphological, because, as in the case of the inorganic strong participles verwunschen and durchgewunken, they only affect parts of the inflection paradigm. Furthermore, only the weak pattern is still productive today. Neologisms or borrowings do not form their preterite with upload but with a dental suffix, in addition to the neologism Simpson to text, which is admittedly not entirely new. Irregular strong forms Sams and gesumsen could be formed along the lines of binden, band, gebunden. The fact that the past tense in usage is not Sams but Simste shows that in the modern German norm only the weak inflection is productive. Back to Middle High German Rückumlaut. Beyond this individual case, this example shows that sound changes in language history can often trigger morphological changes, but that no morphophonological automatisms can be derived from such observations. In the last lecture of the series, which will deal with the syntax of Middle High German, we'll certainly come back to the insight that developments on a certain linguistic level can, but do not have to, have an impact on subsequent more complex linguistic levels. The interfaces between inflectional morphology and the subject of the next lecture on Middle High German word formation are less obvious, but this is certainly also due to the fact that very heterogeneous issues are treated under the umbrella of morphology, namely grammatical issues like inflectional morphemes on the one hand and lexical issues like base morphemes on the other. Thank you very much.